Greetings, everyone. Let's begin by turning to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, a very well-known chapter in the Bible, often referred to as the faith chapter. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1. Now, faith is the substance or the realization of things hoped for, the evidence or the conviction of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good report. Tremendous definition of living faith. Drop down to verse 6 of Hebrews 11. Without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. So as Christians, it's not optional regarding faith. As Christians, we must have faith. We must be growing in faith. We must be developing living faith. It must be a way of life. Because without faith, it is impossible to please him. Now let's go to verse 13 of Hebrews 11. Of course, we know many heroes are mentioned in this chapter of Hebrews 11. And notice what it says here in verse 13 of Hebrews 11. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded, were assured of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. They died in the faith. And here's a very famous hero in the Bible and in history who died in the faith. Notice here in verse 32. What shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson, of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets. The first one mentioned here is Gideon, a man of faith, listed as a man of faith. And notice what that faith led these people to do, Gideon being one of them. Here in verse 33 of Hebrews 11, who through faith, not through their own might, not through their own power, not through some kind of incredible weaponry, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant or became valiant in fight, and turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Mighty things were done by these people who had little strength. It says here in verse 34, out of weakness were made strong. Well, today I want to talk about Gideon and faith, but in order to do that, you have to start with talking about Joshua to get the full picture of what Gideon and his army did. So we're going to talk about Joshua and Gideon and faith, because to really understand the full story, we have to start with Joshua and Israel. Then we go to Gideon and his army, and we tie it all together with faith in terms of what the Bible explains and in terms of what the Bible shows was done and how it was done. So let's turn to Joshua chapter 1. And of course, as we go through this, we can all learn lessons in our personal lives and in the church and in the work. All of these things were given for our admonition and for our example. We're to learn from all of these things. Here in Joshua chapter 1 and verse 1, we read about one of the greatest men in the Bible, as far as I'm concerned, a tremendous servant of God, a tremendous leader, a man that was full of faith, a man that was loyal, a man that was dedicated, a man that spent most of his life in service to God. He was an Ephraimite. So in modern terms, we're talking about a Canadian or a Brit or an Australian or a New Zealander. He was an Ephraimite. And it says here in Joshua chapter 1 and verse 1, Now after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke unto Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' minister, saying, See, he was with Moses from the beginning. While Israel was still in Egypt, when they came out of Egypt, all through the 40 years in the wilderness and on into the promised land, Joshua was right at the top in the nation of Israel. Sometimes when God would call Moses to come and meet with him in the tent, Joshua was right there with Moses. And so he was intimately acquainted with what God did through Moses and intimately acquainted with what God did for Israel because he was a part of all of that. Verse 2, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise. This is the Eternal speaking to Joshua. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, unto the land which I do give to them, even to the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that have I given unto you, as I said unto Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, even unto the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and unto the great sea, toward the going down of the sun, shall be your coast. An incredible piece of real estate. There shall not any man be able to stand before you all the days of your life. This is what God is telling Joshua. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you. I will not forsake you. Several of the discussions that God had with Joshua are recorded in the New Testament and quoted in the New Testament. Be strong and of a good courage, for unto this people shall you divide for an inheritance the land which I swore unto their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper, that you may have great success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth, but you shall meditate therein day and night. Study it, read it. Keep your mind involved on a daily basis in this book of the law. You shall meditate therein day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written therein, for then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall have good success. Have not I commanded you? Be strong and of a good courage. Don't be afraid. Don't be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Now, you know, that's one of the most incredible pep talks you'll ever read about. This is God really bucking Joshua up. This is God encouraging him. There was a reason for this. There were several reasons. One was Joshua had to have help from God to do what was ahead of him. Number two, Joshua, it was kind of a withering assignment as he began to think about what Moses had done and what now he was about to do or be asked to do. And what a daunting job ahead of him to take over 2 million people across the Jordan River and into a land infested with armies and with pagans and with men and a population that had no heart for life. They were just filled with all kinds of despicable practices. Their regard for life was slim and none. They sacrificed children. They worshiped pagan gods. They sacrificed young virgins. When it came to battle, they showed no mercy, gave no quarter. And they occupied the whole land and had been there for a long time. And now Joshua was supposed to take the nation of Israel into that land and drive them out. So you can see why God took a lot of time to encourage him and to tell him, listen, I'm going to be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. You lead my people and you do what I say and you will succeed. Be strong, be courageous. And you know what? Joshua heard him and he stepped out in faith and believed God. Let's notice now Joshua chapter 5. In Joshua chapter 5 and verse 13. He came face to face with his source of strength here. It came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him, or opposite him, with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him and said unto him, Are you for us or for our adversaries? I really like to read this. Here was Joshua, a man that was bold. He had pluck. You can see why God used him to lead his people. He didn't say, I wonder who that is over there. Some of you fellows go over and check that out, would you? He just boldly walked up there and said, Who are you? Are you for us or against us, to use the vernacular? Who are you? Are you for us or for our adversaries? I want to know that right now. And he said, No, but as captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. And then Joshua realized who he was facing here. And he fell on his face to the earth, and he did worship him. And he said unto him, What says my Lord unto his servant? Lord, what will you have me do? He came face to face with the captain of the host. He came face to face with the one who later was Jesus Christ. Notice here in verse 13, And the captain of the host said unto Joshua, Loose your shoe from off your foot, for the place whereon you stand is holy. And Joshua did so. All of a sudden, Joshua completely surrendered to this great being, the captain of the host, the rock, the Lord, and said, What would you have me do? Now you can imagine how strengthening that was. You can imagine how encouraging that was. You can imagine how energizing that was to Joshua to know that here we've come across the Jordan River. We're about to surround Jericho, and look who's on our side. I just came face to face with him. He's with us. Now, it's interesting if you want to do a study to see some of the things that Joshua and the Israelites did. You can look at maps and you can chart it. It's an incredible military invasion, really. The tactics and strategy is absolutely brilliant. This was a large army. Thousands and thousands and thousands of men of war from Israel going into a country just infested with enemies that were vicious and cruel, used to living in the desert, and knew all kinds of tactics of war and had all kinds of weaponry. You can draw a little map. You'll see they came in across the Jordan River. That's an interesting story. When you study that, it was swollen with the spring rains because this occurred about 40 years after Israel came out of Egypt through the Red Sea. Soon after they crossed the Jordan, they kept the Passover and the days of unleavened bread, just like Israel did once they got out into the wilderness. And the first thing they did was come to the city of Jericho. I won't take time to go into that account, but I wish you would, because it's really interesting. Here you have Jericho, a walled and fenced and fortified city, and they had heard about the Israelites and the army of Israel and how they were conquering everyone and defeating everyone in their path, and now they've come across the Jordan River, and now they're approaching the city of Jericho. And they see that. I mean, can you imagine 2 million people, women, children, families, herds, flocks, produce, all of it, men of war, equipped for war, and they're coming toward your city. All the gates are barred. All the windows are shut. Everything is ready for battle. And they're on the wall watching and seeing this huge confluence of people beginning to descend to where they are. And when they get there, they do something that left them amazed. Instead of attacking, they simply got organized and circled the city. This is something I hope I get to see sometime on film. I don't know if I ever will. But here's this big, huge gathering of people. And the ark was there, and the priests were there, and they had trumpets, and men of war were there. And they just simply circled the city. They didn't say a word. They just walked all the way around the city, totally quiet, except the trumpets were being blown, and then went back to their camp. The next day, they showed up early in the morning, did the same thing. You know, about the third day, you can imagine how these pagan people in this city began to have a little fun and say, well, they're just going to march us to death? Is that what they're going to do? I mean, they would yell and jeer and taunt and challenge and make fun of. You keep reading the story. They just kept walking around the city for 6 days. And then on the Sabbath, the seventh day, they showed up. And for 6 days, they had been marching around this city of Jericho, not saying a word. And then on the seventh day, they marched around it 6 times. And the seventh time, there was a tremendous blast and a tremendous shout from everyone. I imagine that was a great relief. They'd been holding it back all that time. And then the city of Jericho began to rumble and shake and crumble and crack, and it came crashing down on top of all the inhabitants. It wasn't done by bows and arrows. It wasn't done by spears. It wasn't done by catapults. It wasn't done by assaults on the walls. It was done because they did what God said. And by faith, the walls of Jericho came crashing down. There's an interesting archaeological study you can do as well, because these great scholars and these great experts say that if you go to Jericho, I've been there, probably some of you have been there, you'll see that the walls didn't fall down flat like the Bible said they would. But research since and excavation since have shown that indeed the walls did fall down flat, just like the Bible said. And there's evidence that the city was burned, just like the Bible said. And there's one area along one side of the wall that didn't totally fall down flat, which was probably where Rahab and her family were, and were spared like God said they would be. And then that later was burned also. But you can have a wonderful family Bible study going through all of that. And while we're talking about it, let's notice here in Hebrews chapter 11, because it ties directly in with faith. Yes, they had a big army. Yes, they had a powerful, powerful force. But that's not what defeated Jericho. And that's not what brought down the walls. Notice here in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down. And in other verses it says, fell down flat, after they were compassed about, or encircled about, 7 days. God did that for them. And then after that, Joshua camped a while at Gilgal, then moved on Jericho, and then after that took the city of Ai, and after it he returned to Gilgal. And then later on he made peace with Gideon and then moved through the valley of Ajalon and defeated the 5 Amorite kings, moving south. And then from there he launched a southern campaign against Lachish, Hebron, Debir, and Gaza. Now you hear a lot about these places in the news, don't you? The Gaza Strip. Well, they took over Gaza. He defeated everyone in his path. And then he returned to Gilgal. It's interesting when you read about all these nations that he just rolled up as he went through. Now, God could have removed them all before the Israelites crossed the Jordan, but he left them in there so the land wouldn't be desolate and run over, and he just removed them step by step. The Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, what names? Parasites, the Trilobites, Stalactites, all of them. All the its and ats and ites. And then he returned back to Gilgal. Now, he hasn't even gone up north yet. He gets his army together. He lets them rest. He lets them work on and bring their equipment up to speed. And he organizes the northern campaign, and they go up north all the way up to Hazor or Hatzor. This all took probably around 6 or 7 years. You can imagine they didn't have tanks and troop carriers and airplanes and all of the methods of war and tools of war and weapons of war that we have today. They had swords, and they had bows and arrows, and they had truncheons, and they had chariots, and they had to walk and march. So it took months and months and months and months. They had to take provisions with them, of course. And yet, over a period of time, they began to simply take over the promised land from the east to the west and from the south to the north until in about 5, 6, 7 years, God had given most of the land of Canaan into the hands of Joshua and Israel, just like he said he would. Let's turn now to Joshua chapter 8. Joshua chapter 8 and verse 34. Interesting to see the attitude of Joshua. He was a mighty leader, a mighty general, a mighty warrior, a mighty servant of God, but there's humility there as well. He had faith, but he also had humility. He was a close servant to Moses, and Moses gave him instructions. And he was to follow these instructions once he got into the promised land and began to have this success. Now, you know, Moses had died. Moses was not around anymore. Joshua could have just said, well, okay, Moses was a great servant of God, and I learned a lot from him, and I know he told me to do this, but he's gone now, and now I'm here, and so I think we'll just go ahead and do what we think we ought to do, and we can just kind of leave Moses out of the picture. But that's not what Joshua did. He followed Moses' instructions to a T. Notice here in Joshua chapter 8 and verse 34. You can pick it up and get the context, but afterward he read all the words of the law, the blessings and cursings, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There is not a word. Get this. Now, this was not a namby-pamby kind of sissy guy. This was a man who was a powerful leader. But he was still humble enough to take directions even from a man who no longer was alive, because he knew God was in the picture. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded which Joshua read not before all the congregation of Israel, with the women and the little ones and the strangers that were conversant, or that were living among them. Once again, a very interesting event. You can read it over in Deuteronomy 27, where this was to be done, and you can read how a group was supposed to be on one side and a group was supposed to be on the other side. And then when the blessings and cursings were read out, all the people would say, Amen. That's in Deuteronomy chapter 27, I think, verse 11 and on down. And here, Joshua did exactly that right here in Joshua chapter 8 and verse 34. It is recorded. I think that's encouraging to see a man as devoted and as converted and as humble and as powerful and so dedicated to serving God and to those who trained him before, that he carried out their instructions. Even though he wouldn't have had to, really. He had the power not to, but he did it. Let's notice now chapter 10, Joshua chapter 10, and verse 42. Joshua 10 and verse 42. And all these kings and their land did Joshua take at one time, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel. And Joshua returned and all Israel with him unto the camp to Gilgal. In some cases, he just took whole sections of land in one maneuver. That's the case here, which we've already mentioned. And then he returned and all Israel with him. And how did this happen? How did this happen? Keep this in mind, brethren. Because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel. Now, is that too spiritual for us to grasp? Can we get our mind wrapped around that? They had to do their part, but the success came because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel, and they had faith in him, and they did what they were supposed to do and what God said. And look at the tremendous battles that were given into their hand. They relied on God, and he fought for them, and they won. Notice here in Joshua chapter 11 and verse 23. So Joshua took the whole land, and that's no small feat. You do an in-depth study, and you will see this is an absolutely incredible thing. Just like it was an amazing thing to extract Israel out of Egypt, through the Red Sea, and out into the wilderness, this was an amazing thing to take that same nation and bring them over the Jordan River and establish them in the land of Canaan. No one could have done it except God. But they had to be yielded to God and follow him in faith in order to get this done. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord said unto Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance unto Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. And the land rested from war. They had peace and prosperity at last throughout the tribes of Israel because they were obeying God. And they were walking in faith. And they had a leader who did what God said. Notice here in Joshua chapter 21. Joshua chapter 21 and verse 43. And the Lord gave unto Israel all the land which he swore to give unto their fathers, and they possessed it, and they dwelt therein. And the Lord gave them rest round about, according to all that he swore unto their fathers. And there stood not a man of all their enemies against them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. Now you can read an example where they didn't do what he said in one battle, the city of Ai, and they were soundly defeated. They were routed because they didn't follow what God said in terms of his instructions. And they learned a bitter lesson there. This success, these victories came because they served God. They did what he said and they went forward in faith, and therefore then he blessed them. That's the only reason this happened. He gave it to them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. Verse 45, there failed not aught of any good thing which the Lord had spoken unto the house of Israel. All of it came to pass. An amazing time, an amazing period of history in the nation of Israel. Chapter 23 of Joshua, verse 1, God keeps his word. He will do what he says he will do. And if we obey him, we can just be showered with so many wonderful things in our personal lives, in our families, in our home, in the church, in the work. You know, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that same being that was standing face to face with Joshua, with that gleaming sword, telling him, look, I'll take care of it. You do what I say and I'll fight your battles. That's the same being who is the head of this church today and the head of this work. He doesn't play favorites. He loves us as much as he loved Joshua and the leaders of Israel and the obedient Israelites in those days. We're spiritual Israel. He doesn't show partiality. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He sees what's ahead of us in terms of finishing the work, in terms of building character, in terms of making it into the kingdom of God, like they went on into the promised land. He will never leave us or forsake us. If we obey him and do what he says and look to him in faith and follow where he leads, he will give us just as much success and just as much prosperity, and even more so that he gave the Israelites. And not a single word and not a single promise that he gives will go unfulfilled, just like it didn't go unfulfilled in their day. But it takes faith and it takes obedience. Joshua chapter 23 and verse 1. It came to pass a long time after that the Lord had given rest unto Israel from all their enemies round about, that Joshua waxed old, or grew old. He was old and stricken in age. And Joshua called for all Israel, and for their elders, and for their heads, and for their judges, and for their officers, and said unto them, I am old and stricken in age, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done unto all these nations because of you. For the Lord your God is he that has fought for you. And he keeps his word, God does. And so now Joshua is preparing the nation for his death and showing them what they must do to carry on in this way of life that God has blessed them with. And now we notice Joshua chapter 24 and verse 14. Here's the kind of attitude, the kind of man, the kind of approach, the kind of character that this incredible servant of God had, this man Joshua. Can we say this? Can we say this individually? Can we say this in our family? Can we say this in our home? I think we can and we have, but we got to make sure we keep on saying it and mean it. It says here in Joshua chapter 24 and verse 14, Now therefore fear the Eternal, serve him in sincerity and in truth. Put away the gods which your father served on the other side of the flood, or the Euphrates, and in Egypt, and serve ye the Eternal, serve ye the Lord. And if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Eternal. There's no holding back. It's unconditional. It's not half-hearted. It's wholehearted. We have made up our mind. We have put it all on the line. And as for me and my house, we're going to serve God all the way to death. That's what Joshua said. And that's what he did. And that's what we must say, and that's what we must do. Now, as we read about Canaan, and as we read about all these gods and all these pagan practices and all these evil goings on, we can think, well, that was long ago and far away. We have the same evil going on around us today, the same worship of idols, the same worship of gods, the same rotten, horrible practices happening in the world today, all over the world. They sacrifice children. We have abortion going on in our society. They had all kind of hideous immorality rampant everywhere. Well, I mean, look at what's happening in entertainment. Look at what's happening in all of the sleazy things going on around us. We have the same battle, and we have to say the same thing. As for me and my house, we will serve the Eternal. That's the choice we've made, and it's cemented in stone. And the people answered and said, God forbid that we forsake the Lord to serve other gods. Words came easy, but as we will see, those were just words. Now notice verse 29. Joshua 24 and verse 29. And it came to pass after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Eternal, died being 110 years old. And they buried him in the border of his inheritance, which is in Mount Ephraim on the north side of the hill Gaash. And Israel served the Lord, verse 31, all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, which had known all the works of the Lord that he had done for Israel. And so Joshua left such a tremendous and powerful legacy that after he died, all the men that he trained kept on serving God. And the Israelites followed them and kept on serving God. But then all those men and leaders died. And then trouble set in. Now we come to the book of Judges. Judges chapter 1. So you see, in Israel, there was such success and so much prosperity and so much abundance, a land flowing with milk and honey, peace on all the borders, no more war, rest, just tremendous wealth everywhere. And so people began to get a little bit soft. They began to get a little bit laid back and lethargic. They began to take things for granted. They started doing what God warned them not to do from the beginning. When you go into the land where there are houses you didn't build and wells you didn't dig, you better be careful, because you're going to forget the Lord your God if you're not careful. And that's what they did. And you know what happened? An apostasy set in. An apostasy set in among the nation of Israel and among the leaders of Israel. God no longer was so important. His way of life was no longer so interesting. But the easy, gratifying to the flesh way of life of the surrounding population began to be important. See, they didn't fully follow all that God said. He said that they were to drive every single one of these nations and every single one of these towns and every single one of these people out of the land of Canaan. Drive them all out. Don't let any of them stay here. Clean every inch of this land out of these hideous, pagan, savage people, from top to bottom and side to side. But they didn't finish the job. They didn't totally finish the job. And therefore, the way of life of these pagan cities and towns and tribes began to be kind of interesting. It started catching the imagination of the Israelites. They started to intermingle and then intermarry and then began to worship the gods of these nations, these false gods. They began to take on different doctrine, follow different teachings, turn their back on God and His law and His way of life and His holy days, and go the easy route, and started drifting away from God. And therefore, God began taking His blessings away. That's not what God said He would do if they would obey Him. They could have continued in on this way of life if they had done what He said. Notice here in Judges chapter 1 and verse 1. Now after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, Who shall go up for us against the Canaanites first to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have delivered the land into his hand. And so that's what was to happen. And God said He would lead them, and He would fight for them and win their battles. Notice verse 28 of this chapter of Judges. It came to pass when Israel was strong. See that? When they were strong. When they were at the top of their game. When things were going great. When there were no worries or trouble or pain or suffering or poverty or any of that to contend with. Instead of building on that and getting closer to God and living His way more perfectly, no, lethargy set in. Spiritual drift started taking over. And they began to feel like, well, it's not all that important to do exactly what God says. And so it came to pass in verse 28, when Israel was strong, that they put the Canaanites to tribute or forced labor or slavery. They did not utterly drive them out like they were told to do. And just keep on reading, you'll see, neither did Ephraim drive them out, neither did Zebulun drive them out, neither did Asher drive them out. They started to do things their way. This is the cycle that you will find as you go through the book of Judges. You will find a virtual, full-blown apostasy sets in, and drifting away from God leads to collapse and decay. They drift away from God or run away from God, then trouble comes, then they cry out to God, then a judge comes along, and God delivers them through that judge, and then that judge dies, and they immediately start drifting away again. They go into utter barbarianism and paganism, and then they cry out to God when they're about to be crushed, and another judge delivers them, and it's just a cycle, over and over and over again. And the underlying basic theme and attitude you'll find that set in among the Israelites was that they were going to do it their way, not God's way. Notice Judges chapter 21 and verse 25. They didn't want government. They didn't want guidance and direction. They didn't want to follow the commandments. They didn't want to submit to God and those He chose to lead them. They wanted to have freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of decision apart from God. They wanted to go it on their own. They wanted to walk to the beat of their own drummer. In those days, verse 25, Judges 21, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Of course, that's everywhere on earth today. And frankly, that's what set in among God's people and has been going on for years now. People just kind of figuring out what's right according to how they see it. And tailoring and nipping and tucking the scriptures and being selective and overlooking that, but focusing on that and twisting that and turning that and modifying that and turning out a just wonderful set of doctrines and wonderful set of standards that's just comfortable, really, really comfortable. Doesn't require a whole lot of sacrifice. Doesn't require crying out to God. Doesn't require fervency and passion in obeying God. Just nice and easy. Live lightly on the earth. Let's just all get along. Let's just love one another. Let's don't get too stirred up. Let's don't get too carried away here. Surely God wouldn't require that. As long as we're just nice. As long as we mean nice, sound nice, look nice, and we're nice, what else is it that God would require of us? What's this thing about being a living sacrifice? And so that's the attitude they had, and because of that, look what happened to them. Let's notice here in Judges chapter 2. Judges chapter 2 and verse 11. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. And what did they do? They served Balaam. Boy, they just went straight into paganism. Balaam, worshiping Baal. Took it all the way back to Semiramis and Nimrod. All of the pagan worship that we see around us today, they were doing way back then. And did evil in the sight of the Lord. And it got to where it was hard to find anybody that had any manhood among the men of Israel. Where are the men that will stand up? Where are the leaders that will put it all on the line? Where are the men that will lead God's people, teach the truth, live the truth, and put their life on the line for the truth? And so God had to use a woman, like a mother, in a particular period of time during the period outlined here in Judges. Notice here in Judges chapter 5 and verse 7, Deborah and Barak. You can read a lot about this. But what has come to this magnificent nation that came out of the wilderness, through the Jordan River, into Canaan, and was feared far and wide by everyone, because they knew that they had some supernatural power that guaranteed victory every time. It's just falling apart. It's unraveled. It's almost unrecognizable, to the point to where there are no mighty men. So here's what happens. The inhabitants of the villages ceased. They ceased in Israel until that I, Deborah, arose, a mother in Israel, and began to give guidance, began to give encouragement, began to give admonition, began to remind and review. She was the strongest leader around. She didn't lead in battle, but there she was, kind of like an anchor, reminding Israel of God and what they have to do, and if they do it, it'll work. If they don't do it, it won't work, because where were the men to step up and do that? They couldn't be found. So as a result of this, the cycle and direction in this whole nation during this whole period went downward, downward, downward at an accelerated pace. Let's turn now to Judges chapter 6. This was a sorry state of disintegration, and it led to crushing defeat. Israel was about to be wiped out. So you see, we have to connect all these events to come to the point to where there was a need for Gideon. And now we see why Gideon came on the scene and why God designated him to do what he did. Notice here in Judges chapter 6 and verse 1, And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian 7 years. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel, and because of the Midianites the children of Israel made them the dens which are in the mountains, and caves and strongholds. They have gone from the incredible position of being the most wealthy and powerful nation on earth to the place where they're scattered and hiding in dens and caves, and even have to hide their food because they've been run over by these ignominious idiots called the Midianites. And so it was, when Israel had sown, that the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites and the children of the east, even they came up against them, and they encamped against them and destroyed the increase of the earth, till you come unto Gaza, and left no substance for Israel, neither sheep, nor oxen, nor donkeys, for they came up with their cattle and their tents, and they came as grasshoppers for multitude. For both they and their camels were without number. They were just masses of people. And they entered into the land to destroy it. And Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites. And the children of Israel cried unto the Lord. I'll tell you, we can draw a lot of analogies here. Rather than do that, let's talk about the principles. But I'll just say this much. Anybody remember how the holy people of God have just been scattered everywhere? Everywhere. I could start mentioning names and more names in the ministry and in the church who I don't even know where they are now. Just scattered everywhere. Just taken over. People who never would have thought or done what they now think and do. Look at this horrible, sorry state that the nation of Israel is now descended into. Only because they quit obeying God. If they had continued to obey God and follow where He led and yield and surrender to Him and in faith carry out His directions, it would have been endless prosperity and power. But no, they started backing off. They started doing things their way. They started looking for comfort, and they started looking for pleasures. And they ended up being enslaved by the Midianites. And it came to pass, when the children of Israel, verse 7, cried unto the Lord because of the Midianites. They cried. Verse 8 says, that the Lord sent a prophet unto the children of Israel, which said unto them, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I brought you up from Egypt, and brought you forth out of the house of bondage. And I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of all that oppressed you. And I drove them out from before you, and gave you their land. Now I read this and I think, how could they forget all that God did for them in bringing them out of Egypt, and the plagues that He poured out in order to deliver them through the Red Sea, out into the wilderness, and how if they would obey Him, He would take them through the wilderness, and 40 years later through the Jordan River and up into the land of Canaan, and establish them in such a splendid manner. How could they forget all of that? But brethren, human beings forget. Think about our lives. Think about all He's done for us. Think about all He's done for the church. Think about all the spiritual wells that we have come into that were here waiting for us when we came into the church. Think about the spiritual doctrines. Think about the spiritual directions. Think about the spiritual way of life. We didn't dig that out. We came here and were taught it. It was here when we came in. Think about the hungry kind of cravings we had to know why we're here, where we're going, what life is all about, what brings happiness. How come I don't have fulfillment and peace of mind? And now we come into the church and we have fulfillment and peace of mind, and we know why we're here, where we're going, and how to get there. But it's easy to forget all of that. It's easy to forget who brought us into the church. It's easy to forget who God used to teach us these doctrines. It's easy to forget that we didn't have these doctrines before, and now we have them. We have answers that work and get results. That's what they did. They forgot. And they were enslaved. Satan is a powerful enemy of the church. He wants to destroy the church, and he wants to destroy God's people. Christ won't let him, but he's on the job, and he's wreaking havoc. I brought you forth out of the house of bondage. I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, out of the hand of all that oppressed you. And I drove them out from before you, and I gave you their land. And I said unto you, I am the Lord your God, verse 10. Fear not the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But you have not obeyed my voice. You have not done what I said. And therefore, you are about to be wiped off the face of the earth. And then on the scene comes this man, Gideon. So you see how all of this led to the point where now we see Gideon has to come on the scene. And God is going to use him to rescue Israel from being wiped out totally, stamped out, and no longer to exist. Let's notice verse 11 of Judges chapter 6. Just go right down here. Then let's just keep reading. Verse 11, Judges 6. There came an angel of the Lord and sat under an oak, which was in Ophrah, that pertained unto Joash, the Abiezrite, and his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Gideon was from Manasseh. Once again, when I read this, I think, well, let's see now, where do we find Manasseh? Here he was, Gideon, a Manassite. And there he was, minding his own business, threshing wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. See, they had to hide their food. The existence that they had now was just an ignominious, pathetic existence. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. Here was a very courageous individual. And as we've already read, someone who had faith. He didn't capitulate to the paganism around him. He didn't capitulate to idol worship and going up into the groves. He did the best he could in his own situation to continue to follow God's way of life, but it wasn't easy. And God noted that. And even though it looked like everything was about to go down the drain, here was a man who continued to try to follow God in the circumstances he was in as best he could, and God noted that. And he began to see and notice and focus on this mighty man of valor who was full of faith, or certainly who had faith, and who was still trying to obey him. And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? Look at this dialogue that goes on in this personal relationship that we have with Almighty God and Jesus Christ. Why then is all this befallen us? And where be all his miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. And the Lord looked upon him and said, Go in this your might. He was a mighty man. And you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent you? And he said unto him, O my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least, the youngest in my father's house. And the Lord said unto him, Surely I will be with you. Now you see, you find the same theme going through here. look, Gideon, I'm giving you an assignment that's going to be virtually humanly impossible. But keep this in mind. I will be with you. Now, brethren, we are facing impossible odds as well. But keep this in mind. God says, I will be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. Do we have faith in that statement? I hope we do. He did. Surely I will be with you, and you shall smite the Midianites as one man. And he said unto him, if now I found grace in your sight, then show me a sign that you talk with me. See, things had gotten so rough, he probably, I know he had faith, but maybe his faith wasn't as strong as it once was or as it should be. And so he said to him, can you give me some encouragement? Can you show me some indications and a sign here that you're going to be with me as you give me this assignment? Depart not hence, I pray you, until I come unto you and bring forth my present and set it before you. And he said, I will tarry until you come again. Now, this angel of the Lord sent there by God represented the power of God and represented God's intervention and God's blessing. And so Gideon needed some encouragement from him. And you can continue reading. You will see that a miracle happened here. When he laid the meal out for him, there rose up fire, verse 21, out of the rock and consumed the flesh and the unleavened cakes. Then the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. And when Gideon perceived he was an angel of the Lord, Gideon said, Alas, O Lord God, for because I have seen an angel of the Lord face to face. And the Lord said unto him, Peace be unto you, fear not, you shall not die. And so that strengthened Gideon. That empowered him. He built an altar. It came to pass, verse 25, the same night that the Lord said unto him, Take your father's young bullock, even the second bullock of 7 years, and throw down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the grove that is by it. Now, this was a risky assignment because they loved their groves and they loved their altars. And so you can keep reading here. You'll see that Gideon took some men with him, and they went up and they completely demolished that altar and demolished that grove. And so God knew that Gideon would do what he said. And of course, when the people of that community found out what had happened, they wanted to know who did it, and they wanted to grab them and kill them because they destroyed their precious altar that they used to worship their pagan gods and their grove that was as pagan as could be. You can read it and you will see that God protected Gideon from sure death. And then he began to be known as an opponent of Baal. He got a new name, verse 32. Therefore, on that day they called him Jerubbaal, saying, Let Baal plead against him, because he has thrown down his altar. And so he was known by that name by some. Now, verse 36, Gideon said unto God, If you will save Israel by my own hand, as you have said, behold, I will put a fleece of wool in the floor, and if the dew be on the fleece only, and if it be dry upon all the earth beside, then shall I know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. And it was so, for he rose up early on the morrow, and thrust the fleece together, and wrung the dew out of the fleece, a bowl full of water. And Gideon said unto God, Let not your anger be hot against me. You know, he felt like he might be pushing God a little bit. He put that fleece out there, and he said, When I come in here in the morning, let it be wet. And it was, but it was dry all around it, and he could wring a whole bowl full of water out of it. So now he decided he'd ask God to do the reverse. Let not your anger be hot against me, and I will speak but this once. Let me prove, I pray you, but this once with the fleece. Let it now be dry only upon the fleece, and upon all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night. For it was dry upon the fleece only, and there was dew on all the ground. You know, every time I read that, I think of a friend. We were in college together, and he got interested in a young woman, and he didn't know if he should ask her to marry him. He didn't know if she was the one. So he counseled various ones, but he still didn't know. So he read this, and he decided, well, I think I'll ask God to show me. But he didn't have any fleece, so he used some toilet paper. And at Ambassador College, in front of one of the dormitories, only a few people knew about it. I was his close friend. I knew about it. I told him if I were him, I wouldn't do that. He said, no, it's right here. I'm going to do that. And so he put toilet paper out on the yard and asked God to make it just totally wringing wet the next morning, and then he would know I should marry this young woman. And went to bed. Next morning, he went out there to see what had happened. And not only was there not any moisture on the ground or in the toilet paper, but he saw the little bundle of toilet paper he left out there up in a tree. The wind had blown it up in a tree. So I said to him, have you learned your lesson? Seek counsel. Follow the instructions that we're being given here. Don't start putting out fleece and toilet paper and asking God to show you what you ought to do. I'm happy to say that I heard from him not too long ago. He did get married to this young woman, and now they are about our age, and they have several children, and apparently they have a happy marriage. No thanks to fleece and toilet paper. So therefore, these two incidences strengthened Gideon that God really was going to be with him. Now let's notice Judges chapter 7. We won't read through all of this, but I hope you will, because it is an incredible example of God intervening and giving his people the victory, not based on numbers, not based on physical power or might or expertise, but based on faith. Then Gideon and all the people that were with him, chapter 7, verse 1, rose up early and pitched beside the well of Harod, so that the host of the Midianites were on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people that are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Therefore go to, proclaim to the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him return and depart early from Mount Gilead. And there returned to the people 22,000, and there remained 10,000. How would you like to be among this kind of ragtag, out-of-practice, ill-equipped bunch of Israelite soldiers he was able to cobble together? Scared enough going up against this huge army of savages over there. And then the announcement is made, look, if you want to go home, you can go ahead and do that. And 20,000 said, I'm out of here. And you see them go. Ooh, man. Now there's only 10,000 of us. I mean, it would be tempting. It would be tempting to go ahead and rationalize and get on back home. Okay. You can imagine that Gideon was thinking, you know what? This is not looking too good here. So verse 4, the Lord said unto Gideon, the people are yet too many. Bring them down under the water, and I will try them for you there. And it shall be that of whom I say unto you, this shall go with you, the same shall go with you. And of whomsoever I say unto you, this shall not go with you, the same shall not go. Notice Gideon's faith. He simply did what God said. So he brought down the people, the soldiers, under the water. And the Lord said unto Gideon, everyone that laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, him shall you set by himself. Likewise everyone that bows down upon his knees to drink. And the number of them that lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, were 300 men, but all the rest of the people bowed down upon their knees to drink. In other words, of the 10,000, 300 kept their weapons on and were still being alert. They got on one knee and they just simply brought the water up like this, and they were still equipped and they were still armed and they were alert. The rest got to the water. They disarmed themselves, laid everything on the ground, got down on their knees, stuck their face right down to the water and just started drinking it. That's not what you want to do when you're in a state of war. You want to be watching things. So I don't know all the reasons for this, but I think that's one of the reasons that God said, okay, verse 7, the Lord said unto Gideon, by the 300 men that lapped will I save you, and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Let all the other people go, every man unto his place. And so now, 9,700 more soldiers left, and there are 300 left out of 32,000. To go up with Gideon against about 135,000. Or in some commentaries, they say more like 192,000, but later on we'll read a verse that adds up to 135,000 at least of the people or the armies that it's talking about there. If you figure that out, that's a ratio of about 1 per 450. They're going up against mighty men of war, evil, vicious, hardened desert soldiers. This is a terrifying thing. This is not a Disney movie. This is not a kind of a Mother Goose rhyme here. This actually happened. And you know, as I read through and study this, I began to realize the 300 men had to have faith too. Gideon had faith, but the 300 men had to have faith too. They could say, well, come on, this is utterly ridiculous. Why is God requiring this? This is suicide. We're going to be marched right into the jaws of death. We're just going to be cannon fodder. But they didn't do that. So the people took victuals in their hand and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man into his tent, and retained those 300 men, and the host of Midian was beneath him in the valley. And it came to pass the same night that the Lord said unto them, arise, get you down unto the host, for I have delivered it into your hand. But if you fear to go down, go you with Purah your servant down to the host. So they went down and scouted it out, and they overheard some soldiers in a tent talking about how scared they were because the Israelites were coming down on them, and they're the people that this God, this powerful God, fights for. And so these soldiers were scared in that tent. Gideon overheard them and his companion. And so that once again encouraged them. Verse 15 of Judges 7, it was so when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and the interpretation thereof that he worshipped and returned into the host of Israel and said, Arise, for the Lord has delivered into your hand the host of Midian. And he divided the 300 men into 3 companies. So now, here's the strategy. Here's the tactics. We take 300 and we divide them into 3 columns of 100 apiece. Now, they're going up against a well-armed, well-trained, well-fed, well-rested, powerful army of well over 100,000. Think about it. You can just imagine how the Midianites were talking about what fun they were going to have with this little band of Israelites who have the audacity to come up against them. And then look what they were given. They weren't given the latest in double-edged swords. They weren't given the latest in crossbows. They weren't given the latest in spears. They weren't given the latest in weaponry. He divided the 300 men into the 3 companies, and he put a trumpet in every man's hand with empty pitchers and lamps within the pitchers. Woo, boy. We got them now. Here's a piece of pottery and a torch in there and a trumpet. Let's see. I could blow the trumpet and deafen one of them. I could set the clothes fire of another one, and I could hit another one over the head with the pitcher, and then I'm out of ammo. What happens then? But remember, it was faith. He said unto them, Look on me and do likewise. And behold, when I come to the outside of the camp, it shall be that as I do, so shall you do. And they followed his instructions to a T because they had faith in God and they had confidence in him, their leader. When I blow with the trumpet, I and all that are with me, then blow you the trumpets also on every side of all the camp, and say, The sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Shout it out. So Gideon and the 100 men that were with him. And another thing I like about Gideon, he wasn't behind the lines in a dugout issuing orders over a cell phone. He led one of the columns. He was in the thick of battle. He set the example. He didn't say, Do as I say. He said, Do as I do and do as I say. So Gideon and the 100 men that were with him came unto the outside of the camp in the beginning of the middle watch. This was after midnight. This was dark. The Midianites are bedded down, well fed. The campfires are going out. It's pitch black dark, peaceful, quiet. They don't feel threatened. And they had but newly set the watch. And so as they got in place, when he gave the signal, they blew the trumpets, broke the pitchers that were in their hands, and the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers and held the lamps or torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands to blow withal. And they cried, The sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Can you imagine if you're in a deep sleep and all of a sudden you hear this crunch of pottery and this blast on a trumpet, and you look up and all around you you see these torches blazing? All of a sudden, the scouts may have told you wrong when they came back and gave the report of such a puny little enemy approaching. It looks like there's a massive army that has surrounded us and caught us sleeping in our tents. We've had it. And so they stood up, every man in his place round about the camp, and all the host ran and cried and fled. And the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And so they started bumping into one another in the dark. They assumed the enemy was in among them, so they started hacking one another and stabbing one another and fighting one another, and they turned on themselves and began killing one another, and then fled. And as you read on through here, you'll see other Israelites then took up the battle and started chasing them until finally the Midianites were destroyed. There was total victory. Total victory. The battle was won by 300 men because God fought the battle and because they had faith in him. Notice chapter 8 and verse 10. Judges 8 and verse 10. Here these 2 kings were and their hosts with them, about 15,000 men, all that were left of all the host of the children of the east, for there fell 120,000 men that drew swords. 120,000 men, 15 left. That's 135,000 altogether, up against 300. What a slaughter. And most of the slaughter, or a good part of it, was the Midianites slaying one another. Now this is an utterly impossible victory, humanly speaking. This could never have taken place, never. But because God said, I'm going to give you the victory, and they had faith in him, they didn't look around and worry about the numbers. They didn't look around and worry about the pottery and the torches and the trumpets. They just simply did what God said and believed he would do what he said. And look at the outcome. Incredible. And this man Gideon had a wonderful attitude. Notice here in Judges chapter 8 and verse 22, of course, by then, as usual, Israel is clamoring for a king. Then the men of Israel said unto Gideon, Rule thou over us, both you and your son's son also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. Be our king. And Gideon said unto them, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. See? God is our king. He will win the battle. He will bless us. He will rule over us. We will serve him. What an attitude. Once again, he could have said, okay, fine. Yeah, I am pretty good. In fact, I'm better than good. I'm great. Yeah, I'll rule over you. Bow down to me. I'm the king. But he didn't do that. What an outstanding attitude. What an outstanding man and servant of God. Well, Israel had some good times after that, but then Gideon died. And you can see that the apostasy set in again if you keep reading here. Verse 32, Gideon the son of Joash died in a good old age and was buried in the sepulchre of Joash his father. And it came to pass as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children, just as soon as he was dead, that the children of Israel turned again and went whoring after Balaam and made Baal-berith their god. And the children of Israel remembered not the Lord their God, who had delivered them out of the hands of all their enemies on every side. And neither did they show kindness to the house of Gideon according to all the goodness which he had showed unto Israel. What an abysmal, wretched state the nation of Israel had drifted down into. Here are some of the lessons in closing that we can draw from Joshua, Gideon, and Gideon's army that apply to us today, both in our personal lives and in God's church and work. Let's turn to Luke chapter 14 and verse 31. Luke chapter 14 and verse 31. Here we see where Jesus Christ tells us to count the cost as we are entering into the covenant of baptism with him. And he uses an example of overwhelming odds, which we are up against. You know, we are surrounded by a world that will eat us alive if we allow it. We're up against an adversary, Satan the devil, that is a perverted, twisted, tremendously powerful being that would destroy us and sift us like wheat if we did not resist him and if Jesus Christ did not protect us. And our human nature has tremendous pulls that we cannot win on our own. It says here in Luke chapter 14 and verse 31, What king going to make war against another king sits not down first and consults whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that comes against him with 20,000? Or else while the other is yet a great way off, he sends an ambassador and desires conditions of peace. He's overwhelmed. Well, we're facing overwhelming odds as well as we count the cost of our calling and of our covenant with Jesus Christ. But instead of negotiating and appeasing and compromising through the strength of Almighty God and by faith in what he says, we're going to go forward right into the battle boldly. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 26. But who did Gideon give credit to? Did he strut and preen and prance and bow up and just bask in the limelight and the accolades of his great leadership? No. He gave God the glory and the credit, and he focused everybody's attention on God. That's what we must do in God's church and work while we do our part. It says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 26, For you see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And base things of the world and things which are despised has God chosen, yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught things that are. And why did he do it this way? And why is he doing it this way? That no flesh should glory in his presence. But of him are you in Christ Jesus, who of God is made unto us wisdom and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, that according as it is written, He that glories, let him glory in the Lord. That's who we focus on. That's who we give the credit to. That's who we give the thanks to. That's who we glory in. He's the one who raised up His church out of the apostasy. He's the one who has opened the doors. He's the one that sends the money. He's the one that sends the ministry. He's the one that brings the people. He's the one that's going to enable us to finish the work. He's the one who will give us the strength and the power, yes, and the faith to keep going forward to prepare the way for Jesus Christ to come again. God is the one who will fight our battles and get it done. And then we will give Him all the credit, because that's where the credit should go. Even when we do our part, He has to show us what our part is and give us the strength to do our part, because we have such little strength. Notice here in Revelation chapter 3. Revelation chapter 3 and verse 7. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, These things says He that is holy, He that is true, He that has the key of David, He that opens and no man shuts, and shuts and no man opens. And boy, that is absolutely true. Will He do that? That's up to Him, but He will never do it unless we completely surrender and submit to Him, do those things that are pleasing in His sight. And one of the things that is pleasing in His sight and is required is living faith. Without faith, no man can please Him. We can have the same kind of faith Joshua had, the same kind of faith Gideon had, and we must, because we have the same source to go to for it, Jesus Christ and God the Father. And when we have that kind of living faith, He will open the doors, and they will not be shut. And the money will come, and the people will come, and the work will take off, even with our little flock. I know your works, verse 8. Behold, I've set before you an open door. No man can shut it. For you have a little strength, see? We have a little strength. So when all this is done, we have to give God the credit. He's the one who did it. Nobody else did. And when all of this gets done, we still have to say, God rules over us. He's the one that's doing it. Thanks be to Him. For you have a little strength. You wouldn't have enough strength to do this. You have kept my word. Yes, we have our part to do. You've not denied my name. Verse 11, Behold, I come quickly. Hold that fast which you have, that no man take your crown. We have a little strength, but we have a big job ahead to do. Just like Joshua did, just like Gideon did. Let's notice Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, and it's all about faith. Faith unlocks everything. Faith ties us in with an unlimited source of power, with unlimited resources. It opens up God's tremendous torrent of blessings that just come tumbling down on us when He's ready and when we're ready. Luke chapter 12 and verse 29. And seek not you what you shall eat or what you shall drink, neither be you of doubtful mind. That's a lack of faith. For all these things do the nations of the world seek after, and your Father knows that you have need of them. But rather seek you the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. Fear not, little flock. For it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell that you have and give alms. Provide yourselves bags which wax not old, a treasure in the heavens that fails not, where no thief approaches, neither moth corrupts. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And look at this. Let your loins be girded about, and your lights burning. We're a little flock, but our torches are blazing. And God honors that. And He blesses that, and He will do it more and more as we develop more and more faith and more obedience to Him. But we can be encouraged that through His help and strength, we are getting done what He's given us to do. Notice here in Isaiah chapter 58. It's Him doing it, but He's doing it through human beings that are yielded to Him. And that involves all of us. Look at this, Isaiah 58 and verse 1. Cry aloud, spare not, lift up your voice like a trumpet, and show my people their transgressions, and the house of Jacob their sins. That's being done through God's help and strength and power. In spite of our weakness and in spite of our small size, the trumpet is being blown. And here's what it sounds like. 1 Corinthians chapter 14. 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 8. It sounds the opposite to this. For if the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself to battle? If it's wobbly, if it's watered down, if it's just smooth, acceptable stuff, who's going to prepare for a battle? It's got to be a piercing, powerful, galvanizing sound that stirs people up and focuses them on the job at hand and on their Creator and on the leader, Jesus Christ, that will lead them into battle. And that's the trumpet sound that's going out. It's a certain sound. It's a definitive, definite, specific sound that can be proven and gets more and more powerful all the time, and it's God's doing. It's a consistent sound. And how is this all happening, and how is it going to happen even more and more, both in our personal lives and in the church and the ministry? How are all the needs going to be met that we have as a little flock up against an overwhelming force? The same way the little army of Gideon had what they needed to go up against an overwhelming force. The same way Joshua went up against an impossible land of savage people. It was about faith, courage, obedience. Notice here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7. And brethren, faith is not something we work up. It's not some kind of emotionalism. Emotion has its place. God gave us emotion. But faith is not emotionalism. We ask God and He will give it to us. We get closer to Him and our faith will get stronger. The more we study His Word and the more we pray to Him, the more our faith will be built up. It will happen. It does happen. To every single one of us. It's not some kind of mystery. Faith is not out of reach. If only we could somehow work it up and talk God into giving it to us. That's not how it works. It's a gift. And when we go to Him and we ask Him, please give me more faith. Please increase my faith. Please give more faith to all of your ministers, all of your church, all of your people. Please increase it. Help us to exercise it. Make it living faith. God's going to hear that. And as we yield more and more into His hands and simply do what He says, get the pitcher, get the torch, get the trumpet, and advance as a little flock on the insurmountable and toward the overwhelming odds that we face. And the faith will flow through the church. And incredible things, impossible looking and sounding and seeming things will begin to happen. That's the record we've been reading about here today. Why is that in the Bible? It's nice history, but it's not just a nice story. It is for our benefit, our admonition. It is for our knowledge, our help, our strengthening today. If He did it then, He'll do it now, and He is doing it now. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7. For we walk by faith, not by sight. I ask myself, am I holding back the work because I'm walking by sight and not by faith? You need to ask yourself that. Are we walking by faith? Or do we look at the physical things and then let them decide our attitude and our conclusions? Or do we look at the physical things and decide, here's some things I got to do here and I got to do there, and God will help me do it, it's my part. But most of all, I'm looking to Jesus Christ and to God the Father, and I believe what they say, so I'm just going to keep on going forward, doing everything that He allows me to do. Walking by faith, not by sight. It's not how daunting the job looks. It's not how impossible the path seems. It's about faith in God that takes care of all of that. Just like He did for Israel and Joshua, just like He did for Gideon and his army, just like He'll do for us. Let's conclude by turning to 1 Timothy chapter 6. Paul wrote Timothy and told him this, but you know what? It applies to us, each and every one of us. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 11. But thou, O man of God, people of God, servant of God, servants of God, flee these things, these wrong things, and follow after righteousness. Be filled with righteousness and godliness. Be saturated with faith. We need it in our families. We need it in our lives. We can have it. We must have it. Follow after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, meekness. Verse 12, 1 Corinthians 6, fight the good fight of faith. Lay hold on eternal life, whereunto you are also called and have professed a good profession before many witnesses. And many of God's people and ministers have done that. But we must keep on going. We must keep on fighting the good fight of faith. And we are going forward in faith. And as we do that and build that and increase that and develop that and intensify that and strengthen that, brethren, the promise is very clear in the Bible, both by example and by word. We're going to win the battle that is set before us if we walk by faith.